Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm really excited to bring you a review of 3 science fiction novels. And these are all quite different from each other. I know for a lot of people they say they don't read science fiction, and my usual comeback is the fact that I don't think they've found their subgenre yet. So because these books are all so widely different from each other, I'm tempted to say that there is something for everyone here. And I think at least one of these books will appeal to you, even if you don't normally think that you like the genre of science fiction. All that being said, let's get into the books. First, let's talk about Repo Virtual by Corey J. White. This is an advanced reader copy that I received from the publisher Tor.com. And this follows a man who officially works as a repo man, but really he's more of a professional thief. At the beginning of the story, he gets the opportunity to do an incredibly well-paying job, the kind of job that would let him retire and move out of the city he lives in. However, with an incredible payout comes a lot of risk, and so he is hired and agrees to do a job where he is stealing something from a very rich and famous billionaire. Little does he know that what he is stealing is actually an artificial intelligence, and the story goes from there. This was one of my most anticipated releases for the beginning of 2020, and I'm happy to say that this is one that actually lived up to the hype. I really enjoyed this for so many different reasons. First is the world building. This is set in a city that is full of poverty and decay. However, because this is set in a future, there is a virtual overlay where people can put on their virtual reality glasses, and the city just looks a lot shinier and it kind of hides the poverty. But underneath there is that gritty reality, and I loved both the VR aspect to it and the seedy underbelly that was very much present. And I really can see cities going in this direction. There was a part that described where they allowed people to virtually write in this world, but of course people turned that into graffiti, and then they had to put restrictions on that, and then it became used for commercial use, and so it was just a city full of fake advertisements. And I just ate up the world building. I thought it was so fascinating, so realistic and possible, and I really enjoyed that aspect to it. As well, this book has fantastic diversity. It has a main character who is gay, and there's a lot of focus on different ethnic groups. Particularly, there is a lot of representation for Korean people. And I want to say that it's a kind of diversity that I like to see in books where it is simply just there and accepted. It is wildly woven throughout the plot, but it isn't overly pushed to the forefront. So there is a major focus, of course, on the major plot of the heist, and the diversity is just snuck in there in the most casual, accepting ways, and I really like when I see that. And overall, it was just a really good story with a heist plot. I think a lot of us find that to be a bookish buzzword. It definitely is for me, and it was a lot of fun. If I had a complaint, it's simply the fact that I wish that the artificial intelligence aspect of the story had happened much sooner. It almost felt like a spoiler to say that, because it really doesn't happen until like the last section of the book. And you know me, I love an AI story, so I wish it had been there earlier on. But once it happened, I loved it. This book went from being good to great, and I love that perspective. And I just ate up the finale of this book. It was definitely a book that ended strong and was definitely memorable. I wish there was going to be more to this series, but this is a standalone, and that's simply because the fact that I want to spend more time in this world. But it definitely has a satisfying conclusion and clearly is meant to be a single book and not the start of something longer. So if you're someone who just wants to read a piece of science fiction and not commit to like a 9-book series, this is definitely one I'd recommend. I do think it's very accessible and easy to get into because it is kind of set in a near future, and so the technology isn't too overwhelming. And yeah, good characters, good fast-paced plot, and just some really cool ideas thrown in there. There is so much to love about this one, and yeah, I can't stop gushing about it basically. Next, I want to talk about a book called 16th Watch by Myke, and this is one that I received from the publisher Angry Robot Books. And this is set in a future where there is a female Coast Guard that works out in space, and she's close to retirement. She's worked most of her time on Earth, but she ends up at the beginning of the book getting involved in a dispute on the moon involving Americans and Chinese. There is a riot that breaks out and she is called in to help. And of course, the story gets a lot larger and there is a bigger plot, and she is forced out of retirement and has to try to settle some very big political things going on. This is a piece of military science fiction, and it's a genre that I've dabbled in, but I'm finding that there are certain things I like and don't like in it. So full disclosure, this is not a book I finished. This is rather a book that I DNF'd around the 30% mark. I really wanted to give it a proper chance and see it through, but I just was finding that I wasn't invested enough in it, and I have made a policy this year that I am allowing myself to DNF or put down books that I'm not loving in order to avoid getting into a reading slump and move on to something that's more my taste. But while I did DNF it, I want to be clear that I didn't think it was a bad book, it's just not for me. So that's really why I wanted to talk about it, not because I'm afraid to give a negative review, but just simply because what I didn't like about this book, I know other people really well. So first off, if you're not aware, the author himself is ex-military. He worked in the Coast Guard, of course, here on Earth, and that is heavily present in this book. So you get a very authentic, real experience. He uses very real technical terms, and there is a big glossary in the back because he doesn't talk down to the reader and explain things in weird situations. If two military officers are talking to each other, they're not going to explain the terms they're using to each other, which makes sense. So I really like the glossary. I love the technical language. His writing is just really sharp, and this book was definitely heavy on those military aspects and action scenes. And personally, I just realized that while I do read science fiction with a military and political aspect to it, while I read those books, I really read them more for the characters and the emotional impact of that. Not to say that I didn't like the characters, because I actually thought the female main character was a very strong representation of someone who would be a female military officer, and not a strong female in the stereotypical sense of the word, but really a just genuinely strong woman that actually felt very real. So I thought the characters were good, but for whatever reason, they just weren't the kind of characters that I found myself rooting for. And I find that I do look for a level of humor in a lot of my science fiction. This is a good book that is just going to be beloved by other people, which is again why I wanted to take the time to still highlight it. Obviously, I can't comment on the end of the book, the finale, anything like that, but I don't want to overspeak in my review, since this isn't technically a review, but just a discussion of a book that I tried reading and decided to put down. Last but certainly not least, I want to talk about the Book of Strange New Things by Michel Faber. This is the same author that wrote the book Under the Skin, and so I did purchase this book myself on the belief that this one could become a new favorite. And I'll say that it's definitely a contender. I don't love it as much as Under the Skin, but if you're not familiar, this is a literary piece of science fiction that focuses on a married couple, particularly the man Peter, who is a minister that is tasked with going off to another planet to spread the word of God to an alien race that is looking to learn about the gospel, and he leaves his wife Beatrice behind on Earth. The story is partially told through letters that they pass back and forth between each other. Peter is describing his experience as he works with this community and gets to share the word of God, and then his wife is sharing what is happening back on Earth. And you should know that things are not going so well on Earth. This is set in a near future, and kind of like the present day, there is a lot of tragedy and scary events happening. There is some breakouts of pandemics, there is some food scarcity, and just terrible things happening. And if you read the news, it's hard not to be anxious sometimes. I am happy that I read this book before a lot of the current pandemic actually broke out, because I do think this book could be a little bit stressful to read in some of the present climate, but I read it kind of a few months ago and just wanted to include it in this video here. And I'll say that I really connected with a lot of things in the story. First and foremost, I really like a story about a marriage. It is something that is very near to my heart. It is a book that can describe a very honest depiction of a relationship that is not perfect, but is still very loving. And I definitely can tell that the author drew from his own marriage in this book. It's well documented in interviews that he did get inspiration from his own wife, who was dying at the time that he was writing this. And I think this book has a lot of emotional pull, and I really just connected with it. I kind of read this book at the right time where I was going through a transition period myself, and I just found myself kind of embarking on a new journey, going back to work and all of that. And because of that, I just really connected with so much in the story that really spoke to me, probably deeper than it would have otherwise. I will let you know this book is very slow paced. It's much slower paced than a lot of the science fiction I normally read. And as I mentioned, it is literary, which is not normally my cup of tea. But I think the kind of literary fiction that Michel Faber writes just happens to be the kind that works for me. And I really did enjoy this. I think he is a beautiful writer who makes beautiful characters. And there is just a lot to love in this book. It has a lot of deep themes, things to think about. If I had a complaint, it's the fact that this book does become very sad and depressing, and perhaps went to some sadder places than I wanted to. I do want to give a content warning for some serious harm to small animals. I know that bothers some people, and there definitely is some really hard-hitting scenes in here. But if you're looking for a science fiction book that is really not about the science, certainly you learn about the aliens, but more this is a book about humanity, about relationship, about love, about loss, and moving on, growing in your relationship, all of that kind of thing. Again, very different than the other science fiction books I talked about. This is one you might want to check out. Again, very different than what I'm normally recommending, but sometimes a book like that just works for me. And this one I just loved. So if you can't tell, I would recommend it. It's not quite the favorite that Under the Skin was, but it definitely is a contender depending on how this year shakes out for my best of 2020. And yeah, I have a lot of good things to say about it. Well, that is it for this round of science fiction reviews. Let me know how I did. Of the 3 books I talked about, which one are you most interested in? Which one sounds most like your reading taste? As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.